Hi everyone, I am Dr. Robin Murphy and I'm live on Instagram, obviously. I'm a practitioner at Conceive Health and today I'm going to be talking about the microbiome. So as everyone kind of joins in, I'll tell a little bit about myself. I asked my husband last night, what are 3 fun facts that people may want to know about me? So first fact is that I love dancing. This is true. He knows me very well. Second fact is I'm German, Irish, and a little bit of English as well. But what's interesting is I did one of these ancestry genetic tests, and it turns out that I'm part Iberian, so Spanish. That's probably where I get some of the love for dancing. And I enjoy a good dad joke. So when it comes to practice, I work with men and women's health, and some history is I am also a scientific advisor for a genetics company called DNA Labs, and I'm the past co-founder for the IBS Academy. So this brings me into the topic of today, which we're going to talk about the microbiome. So I'm sure a ton of you have heard about the microbiome, specifically around the gut microbiome. But what is relatively new in the conversation is the reproductive microbiome. So I want to kind of open up the stage and talk about the microbiome, talk about, the foods that affect it, the things that we can do to help preserve our microbiome, and what we'll see can improve fertility as well. Okay, so the first question obviously is what the heck is the microbiome? So the microbiome is essentially just a collection of bacteria. So it creates a community of different types of bacteria, and there can be thousands of bacteria. And what we're starting to understand is this could be bacteria, fungi, even viruses, and this ecosystem interacts with our environment. So it interacts with our body as well as our internal environment and external environment. What is it that we're bringing into the body? What are we exposed to? And there's different types of microbiome. So it's like a fingerprint. It's specific to different locations in your body. So your ear, nose, and throat, your oropharynx, your different ears will have different microbiomes depending on which ear you use your cell phone for. Your digestive health, every area has a different microbiome, different levels of bacteria. And then obviously reproductive health. So the reproductive organs, upper reproductive tract, we're talking about more of the cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries. Those were thought to be sterile at one point. But what we're starting to realize is there's a microbiome kind of fingerprint within a woman's reproductive system. So there are a lot of there's about 10,000 or 100,000 less bacteria within the upper reproductive tract than the vaginal ecosystem. And it was once thought, as I mentioned, to be sterile. And now we're starting to understand how the types of microbiome, the types of bacteria that are present within the vagina, within the endometrium, can really affect all different types of reproductive processes. So what we know is that these bacteria will actually impact the production of sperm and egg, so the quality of those sperm and egg, the fertilization process, the pregnancy establishment, as well as maintenance, as well as making sure that it's stopping harmful microbes from attaching to the vaginal tissue. So I got a great question here, and first one of the night, so I'm very excited. So is the microbiome important for a man's ability to reproduce? So yes, it is. This is very early research, but what we see, and I mentioned, is that the microbiome seems to impact both the production of the egg and the sperm. And there's something called the seminal fluid, which is present around the sperm, and this gets produced and ejaculated with the sperm, there seems to be bacteria in there as well. So this is called the seminovaginal microbiome. And this, early on, starting to understand that this can affect our reproductive health. So I just think that is the coolest thing ever. Imagine these little bacteria that are helping us to reproduce. I mean, talk about symbiotic relationship. So pretty cool. So when we talk about reproductive health and fertility, the gut microbiome has an impact, as well as the reproductive. Sorry, I got a call. So when it comes to the gut microbiome, so we do know that people with chronic digestive complaints, like individuals with celiac disease or chronic IBS, there is a higher rate of infertility. And so this infertility is suspected due to a few different reasons. So this can be because of inflammation within the digestive tract. We know that the inflammation can then affect immunity, which is really important for reproductive health. We also know that it can create a lot of oxidative stress. So oxidative stress, the way I like to explain this to patients is, if you cut an apple in half and you leave it out on the counter, what happens? Essentially, the apple will turn brown. Well, why is that happening? It's happening because the oxygen within the air is then reacting to the different proteins, sugars within the apple itself. So when we think about oxidative stress, think about this process that's happening in our cells, around our cells. And this is what's important for cellular function, for ATP and energy production, and extremely important when we talk about fertility. We know that when there's a high amount of oxidative stress, this can cause DNA damage, and this can cause damage to the little mitochondria, the energy power plants that are necessary for proper egg and sperm development. Okay, so second question of the night. If you change your microbiome, can you change your fertility outcome? So this is a great question, and it's a little bit ahead of what I was thinking of where I was going with the talk tonight. But essentially, when a woman has a higher amount of lactobacillus types of bacteria, then there tends to be a better outcome when it comes to pregnancy, fertility, as well as certain assisted reproductive technologies like IUI, as well as IVF. So what's interesting about this is when there's chronic dysbiosis, meaning that there could be some harmful bacteria in the mix with our good bacteria. So these can be related to certain things related or certain diseases related to infertility. So we know that chronic endometritis, endometriosis, as well as pelvic inflammatory disease, all of these can lead to a reduction in pregnancy outcome or infertility. We also know that women who have a higher amount of Gardnerella, as well as urea plasma, tend to have a higher amount or incidence of infertility. And then there's all these specific bugs related to endometriosis. It's quite a complex condition related to immune and inflammation and dysbiosis. And what's fascinating about this is there's actual testing that we can do now to look at the endometrial microbiome. So in my practice, what I'll do is look at microbiome testing for the digestive health. So we know that part of the microbial ecosystem within the vagina and supposed into the uterus and endometrium comes from the digestive tract. So we also know that if you take probiotics orally, that this can help to improve the microbiome of the vaginal ecosystem. So in my practice, I'll do microbiome testing for the digestive tract. And then if someone has a history of recurrent implantation failure or recurrent pregnancy loss, then what can be tested, and there's a really cool company doing this, that's called an EMA test. And so the EMA will actually look at the reproductive, at the endometrial microbiome. So you can actually get this tested to see exactly what are the levels of lactobacillus. Are there any what we call pathogenic strains? So bacteria that is associated more with harmful outcomes or decreased outcomes for reproduction. And then we know that women who have chronic infections like bacterial vaginosis, chronic UTIs, or chronic vulvovaginal candidiasis also can have increased risks for infertility, as well as for a decrease in reproductive outcomes. So things like a premature rupture, preterm birth, or reduced outcome with ART. Okay, so it looks like we have some questions as well. And when it comes to the microbiome, what can we actually do to improve the microbiome? I think that's the top question as practitioners as well as people listening. It's really important to understand what's going on as well as what we can do. So when it comes to the microbiome, there's a lot of general things. You may be able to guess a lot of them, but it has to do with generalized healthy lifestyle. So balanced diet, rich in micronutrients, limited caffeine, alcohol, avoiding smoking, maintaining a healthy body weight, regular exercise. All of this can help generally to support digestive health, the microbiome. When we talk about more specifics, I like to talk more about, or what we can focus on is more fermented food as well as prebiotics. So fermented foods are typically foods that are going to have bacterial culture included in them. And a lot of times these foods will be high in lactobacillus. So lactobacillus is important because specific strains will be producing hydrogen peroxide, and this hydrogen peroxide will then be able to reduce the pH within the vaginal ecosystem. So it reduces or increases the acidity, and then this helps to protect the environment from pathogens and other infections. So typically when we look at lactobacillus-rich foods, these are things like yogurt or kefir. If individuals are sensitive to dairy, then there's actually a coconut kefir as well. It's quite delicious. And then for those who like a little bit more punch, kimchi has a lot of fermentable bacteria. Sauerkraut is excellent. So sauerkraut juice, when we talk about probiotics, if you've ever looked at the back of the bottle, you'll see there's colon-forming units. So they'll talk about, 10 billion, maybe 100 billion for a high number. When it comes to, probiotic foods, this is actually much higher. So just a quarter tablespoon of sauerkraut has trillions of these bacteria. So a little bit of sauerkraut a day goes a long way. You don't need a ton of these fermentable foods, or else you may get a lot of bloating. There's also pickles, tempeh, kombucha. What I do find for patients, so if you are starting to consume a lot of fermentable foods and you're not used to doing it, you can get a lot of bloating. So make sure that you just start with a little bit each day. I'm sure, when you're looking for a certain type of yogurt, make sure that it doesn't have a lot of sugar in it, or artificial flavors or colors. All of that can also impact our healthy microbiome. So the second to that, there are prebiotics. So prebiotics are actually the foods that are feeding the good bacteria. So typically prebiotics are going to be resistant to our digestion, meaning that they're usually fibers that can't really be broken down easily by our digestive tract or digestive enzymes. And so they get to travel all the way through the GI tract. to their designated location. So where these other bacteria are residing, that's where the bacteria will start to break these down. And these prebiotics or resistant starches, they will help feed the good bacteria, lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, Bacteroides. It really depends on the type of foods that you're eating and what it's going to feed. So really high and prebiotics tend to be things like leeks, onions, asparagus, artichoke, garlic, even oats. More green bananas have been shown to be helpful with our microbiome. And then you can also find actual prebiotics that are found in supplements. So this could be called something called xylo-oligosaccharides or fructo-oligosaccharides. So all this means is they're pronounced Zos and Phos, and these are chains of sugars, oligosaccharides, multiple chains of sugars. And these sugars are essentially feeding these type of bacteria. So if you happen to suffer from IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic bloating, then I would recommend being cautious with these prebiotics because, as I mentioned before, with the fermentable foods, this can actually cause a lot more bloating and gas. Okay, so when it comes to additional things that you can do to help with your microbiome, there's other lifestyle factors. So stress is a huge culprit. And it's interesting when you start to understand how stress kind of affects the physiology of our gut and reproductive system. So stress, we, colloquially know this as the fight or flight. So fight or flight is meaning that your body is interpreting the environment as being, you're in a state of danger. So you need to survive. And danger can mean different things. It can mean you're actually going to be attacked by a lion or a tiger, or maybe it's your boss yelling at you, or maybe it's a timeline or deadline that you have a project due. Maybe it's traffic. Maybe it's nutritional stress. Maybe it is inflammatory or immune stress. All of these can instill in the body a physiological process that is going to redirect energy away from non-essential systems to ensure that you have enough energy to drive an increase in adrenaline, heart rate, respiration rate, muscle tension, oxygenation to these organs, and trying to preserve the energy away from these non-essential organs. So during fight or flight, it's all about survival. And this is comparative to our rest and relaxation, which is all about rest, digestion, sleep, sex, reproduction. And so what happens during stress is the blood flow and the chemical messengers to these organs and systems will reduce the activity in this area. So we find that there is a reduction in blood flow, gastric output, hydrochloric acid, digestive enzymes. Even people will find they're either more constipated or they have more loose stool if they're in a really heightened state of stress. And then within the vaginal ecosystem, we can see that women under chronic stress will have different variations in their microbiome as well. So it becomes really important to manage stress ongoing. And that's a huge part of any sort of fertility care because we know that it's going to disrupt hormones and affect metabolic function as well. Things like blood sugar, glucose, as well as utilization of nutrients. So there's other lifestyle factors that can really affect the microbiome as well. So these are just more local hygiene. So thinking about wiping front to back, I'm sure most of us have heard of that. It's important to use antibiotics appropriately. So often what is common is if there's been recurrent infections during childhood or consistent, year over year use of antibiotics, this has been shown to definitely affect the microbiome and can increase risk for increase in other infections and recurrency of infections. We know that exercising regularly can help maintaining a healthy weight. I mentioned hydration, wearing loose-fitting clothes as well as clothes that are breathable is going to be really important. And then making sure that you have regular urination. So you're not holding it in, and you're making sure to void after sexual intercourse. There's a few things that you can avoid doing. So using any sort of fragrances or soaps to douche or wash the vaginal area. Personal care products with dye or flavors or fragrances, spermicides, as well as diaphragms can really affect the microbiome. And then smoking, exposure to alcohol, and then certain foods like heavily refined foods. So sugar, not probiotics, processed oils, and pesticides and herbicides. So this is a big topic because I think this is becoming such a huge issue that we're seeing across the board and globally. So there's particular herbicides that are known, such as glyphosate. So this comes in the name brand as Roundup. So Roundup is, the way that it was marketed is that it's safe for humans. It only affects bacteria. So it affects the pests that are typically eating the plant. And so the manufacturers said, well, this is great. It's not going to affect humans. It only affects bacteria. What they failed to think of is that we have more bacterial cells than we do human cells. So it begs to question, what are we? I'll save that for another video. But essentially, these chemicals, these herbicides, pesticides have shown to have significant effect on our health. And it's probably because of these indirect associations and effects related to the bacteria. So there are studies looking at how these have been related to infertility, and we're going to start seeing more and more of these particular studies coming out. I know the company itself has been sued for things like cancer. So this is something to be mindful of. So it's really important to eat organic, eat a lot of richly colored, fresh, whole foods as much as possible. And a trick to do this is just shopping the perimeter of the grocery store. So making sure that you're going to where the produce is, dairy and eggs, and then making your way around, getting your products and excavating or leaving as quickly as possible. So anything that comes in a box, or, if you can't recognize it from its original product, I always say to patients, it's hard to find a Twinkie tree. So try and stay away from those type of foods as well. So let's look at some other questions here. So this is a good one. What specific strains of probiotics do we focus on for fertility? So I mentioned how lactobacillus is the predominant bacteria within the vaginal ecosystem, and what we find to be highly associated with improvements in reproductive health and outcomes. So typically what you'll find is lactobacillus strains. So there's something to know about probiotics themselves. There's the genus, the family, and then the strain. So you'll notice that there's three sort of words. There's the first word, which would be lactobacillus, and then there'll be all these different types of families. Rhamnosus, so Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Lactobacillus crispitus. I'm probably butchering these. Lactobacillus fermentum. They're kind of fun to say. And then there's specific strains that we want to focus on. So when we look at the research, it's extremely important, and the effect of these, it's extremely important to make sure that you're using the right strain that has been associated with that outcome. So it's like a good example that I heard the other day was related to dog species. So dogs, they come in such variety. They're all part of the same genus and the same family, the canine family, but there's all these different strains, I guess you can think of. So a little Chihuahua, has a purpose. It's a lap dog. And then you have a border collie, a sheepdog. So the sheepdog has a specific action. It has a specific role. And you would never take the Chihuahua to do a sheepdog's job, right? So that's the same when it comes to probiotics. So it's very important to look at the strain. So I'm going to highlight a couple strains that are the most prevalent when it comes to research. And for those who really love digging into this stuff, what I recommend is actually going to the website www.probiotic, let me just look this up so I don't get it wrong, probioticchart.ca. And under women's health, they have a list of probiotics, the types of strains, and their application, as well as level of recommendation and research. So this is a great way for practitioners as well as for everybody listening to just start educating yourself about this. And trust me, this is not all the information. There is so much. There's thousands of research studies coming out a year. So, I mean, it's exploding, this area. So we're seeing a lot of different probiotics being used and marketed. But what I would suggest is going to a practitioner who is familiar with the different strains for the different actions, and making sure that you're using it appropriately. So let's talk about Lactobacillus reuteri. So I'm bringing up a few studies here. So Lactobacillus reuteri RC14. There's also another one called Lactobacillus rhamnosus HN001. So I'm going to talk about these two. So the RC14, this has been used in studies looking at individuals and women who have had recurrent infections. So they're actually using two strains here. So they're using Lactobacillus rhamnosus GR1 as well as Lactobacillus reuteri RC14. So in this study, they looked at women with chronic bacterial vaginosis. And what they were trying to figure out is if women were given an antibiotic alone or an antibiotic with these probiotics, was there any difference in the outcome? And so what the study showed, and this is a 7-day course of antibiotics alongside with the probiotics. So either the control group was given a placebo, the active group was given a probiotic, and they did this for 7 days, both concurrently. And at the end of the study, they found that 81% of the women in the probiotic group had normal vaginal status. So the pH was normal, and then within 30 days of taking the probiotic, it maintained its pH levels, and compared to 31% in the placebo group. So that's a huge difference. It's showing you that the probiotic itself will increase the efficacy of the antibiotic. And so this is really important because what we find is that when there's recurrent infections, if we keep using antibiotics, and definitely they're necessary at times, but if we keep using the antibiotics, there can be resistance that develops as well. So if we can find something that's going to help eliminate the infection and help to sustain the vaginal ecosystem to prevent further infection, then that's really important. There's another study looking at chronic urinary tract infections. So they found that women who had, let me just look at this for a second here. So women who had the antibiotic, so they were doing two different groups here. They were doing one group that had an antibiotic and one group that had the probiotics. And what they were doing is they were looking at how many UTIs were women experiencing for the year. And so at the end of the study, what they found is that the occurrence of UTIs had been reduced by 50% in both groups. However, it was also found that after 1 month, 90% antibiotic resistance had taken place in the antibiotic group. I didn't even know they were going to talk about that, and I talked about antibiotic resistance. I think that's amazing. Okay, I didn't plan that. So anyways, 90% of the antibiotic resistance had taken place in the antibiotic group. And what they found was that, let's see here. So the number of UTIs per year reduced from approximately 7 to 3 in the probiotic group, and it looks like 2.8 in the antibiotic group. So I would say those are relatively comparable. And the benefit is of the probiotic group is that you're not developing antibiotic resistance. And so the probiotics were taken orally rather than as a suppository. Great question. And then when we look at this other study, so this is Lactobacillus reuteri RC14. They looked at the general health in pregnancy. And this is related to group B strep. So women who have group B strep, there is some risk factors later in pregnancy, risk for preterm birth or possible risk for infection of the new baby. So sometimes women will be prescribed antibiotics. So in this group, they gave the probiotic Lactobacillus rhamnosus, GR1, and the Lactobacillus reuteri RC14 to 110 pregnant women who tested positive for group B strep. And then, so at the end of this trial, what they found is that group B strep colonization changed from positive to negative in 42.9% of the probiotic group. So that's pretty great. And then that was in comparison to the 18% of those who actually received the placebo. So still, I find that amazing. Even though they're getting, a placebo, their body was still able to clear the group B strep. So it shows the power of the immune system and the body. But we can see that using the probiotic helped to elevate that a little bit higher. So let's look at a few other bacteria. So probiotics, I should say. So Lactobacillus rhamnosus, HN001. I'm going to test you on this at the end. Just kidding. So I'm just seeing if there's any... Oh, so yeah, this is interesting. So the study that they did was looking at perinatal and postpartum depression and anxiety in women. So we know with the fluctuations of hormones that there can be a massive risk for depression, anxiety. This can have a huge impact on not only the mother, but as well as kiddo as well. So really important here. And I find this fascinating because what this study showed is that they were able to significantly reduce the incidence of postnatal depression and anxiety. So they did a questionnaire looking at a scale of depression. And so individuals who were on placebo, they had about a 9. And then individuals who were on the probiotic had about a 7.5. 7.58. So, 1 point down in that scale. I'm not sure what the scale was on, but the fact that a probiotic can really impact mood speaks to a really interesting connection between the gut and the brain. So the gut and the brain connection, what they talk about is how the bacteria and what they produce, how they influence neurotransmitter production, not only in the digestive system, but as well as in the brain, has a huge impact on our mental health. So it affects our mental health as well as our cognitive health. Inflammation, there's lots of studies looking at things like Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative disease. And it all stems from the types of waste and kind of junk and garbage that the bacteria or the dysbiotic bacteria is producing. A lot of this will then get absorbed through the digestive tract, it goes into the liver, and then it goes into systemic circulation. So there's different byproducts, one of them most commonly known as LPS, lipopolysaccharide. So this is what's stimulating the body's inflammatory response. So we know that chronic inflammation has a big impact on the brain, neurodegeneration, cognitive health, depression, anxiety, as well as reproductive health. And I got a really interesting question about whether or not there's a uterine microbiome and uterine brain connection. So I would say that this is a hot topic as far as like, at the forefront. So good on you for thinking of such an interesting question, because scientists are just starting to understand this. And what they used to think is that the uterus, if it wasn't filled with a baby, it's just kind of dormant and it doesn't really have a big impact on our overall health, or particularly mental health, or brain function. And it's interesting because they're starting to understand some of these chemicals and kind of growth factors that can be released from the uterus that communicates with the brain and communicates with the rest of the body. So we know that these factors, they're called brain-derived neurotropic factors. They can bind to different areas in the body. So they're released from the brain, but also can bind to different parts, the uterus, the reproductive organs. And it helps to signal to the body what's happening. And so this goes back to the fight or flight. If the brain perceives stress and feels like it is under threat, then it needs to communicate to the uterus, the reproductive organs, and all alike. And the reason for that is for efficiency. We don't want to be, producing hormones, utilizing or using up essential nutrients and energy. If we're trying to fight off a tiger, we don't need our reproductive health, essentially. What's interesting too is obviously the ovaries produce hormones, and obviously these hormones will affect the brain health as well. So estrogen is a big one. So estrogen has a huge impact on cognitive health, and there's connections between hysterectomies as well as risk for early onset depression, dementia. So really interesting area of research, and it's very fascinating. Okay, so I talked about testing. Let's see if there's any other questions that are coming up. When it comes to probiotics, can they increase the rate of implantation following embryo transfer? I mean, that's a very specific question. What I can speak to in that regard is that when they look at the vaginal and uterine microbiome, when they're using the EMA test that I talked about. So the EMA test is looking at the endometrial microbiome. It stands for endometrial microbiome metagenomic analysis. This will typically be for repeated implantation failure. So when they are doing ART and they are looking to improve the likelihood of implantation of the embryo, of the egg as well. So what they do find is that when the lactobacillus is low and then they treat it with antibiotics and probiotics, then this can improve the outcome and tendencies for reproduction and pregnancy. So I would say it's too early to say specifically with embryo transfer. I'm sure there's a few studies out there that talk about that. But initially it's important to just look at the lactobacillus. And if there is a history of, early pregnancy loss or implantation failure, then maybe look into the EMA test for sure. And then, I love these questions. What are the top 3 most important things you can do to improve your microbiome if you're trying to conceive? So, I would say it depends. I know you guys hate this sort of answer, but it really depends on who the patient is and kind of what are the health concerns that you're dealing with. So number 1, from the beginning, I would say, what is your gut health? If you have a history of chronic bloating, chronic gas, you have a history of food poisoning or gastroenteritis, traveler's diarrhea, studies show that up to 6 years after those incidents, that it can increase risk for IBS. So IBS, it's irritable bowel syndrome, tends to be associated with kind of chronic inflammation. As I mentioned, it can affect reproductive health. So if that's the case, then make sure that you're starting early to address digestive health. Come to the clinic. We can start working on that 6 months in advance. When it comes to kind of top 3 things, if there's no chronic digestive complaints, if there's no chronic BV or UTI or any history of yeast infections or STIs, remember that your partner too is kind of exchanging bacteria with you as well. Then it's important to make sure that you are increasing your natural probiotics. So I would say eating fermentable foods as well as prebiotics. So I'm going to include that as one. It's really important to reduce stress. I'm going to say that's key for any reproductive health. It helps with the microbiome. And then looking at the quality of the foods that you're eating. So whole foods, there's studies looking at individuals who say they're on a vegan diet and they switch them to a purely carnivore diet. The microbiome will completely change within 4 days. So that's how sensitive your microbiome is to the foods that you eat. I would say those are just the main focus. If you're going to kind of pull out the top 3 things to do, it's a really good place to start. Okay, so is there too much kombucha you can consume when you're trying to conceive or throughout pregnancy? So yeah, I always think there is too much of anything for the most part. Anything can be toxic with enough quantity. Now, the toxicity for kombucha, we always talk in research about, the therapeutic window, but the toxic window, how much would it take of something to become toxic? And we're probably talking gallons and gallons here when it comes to kombucha. A little bit of kombucha, I would say a cup or half a cup is suffice. I know they sell the liters in Whole Foods and other places, and it's a really popular drink, but a little bit goes a long way. And like I said, sometimes what people will notice with the carbonation, with the fermentation, if they have a history of higher yeast content too, I find that people will be a little bit more sensitive to kombucha. So that's where you can notice people may get brain fog. So if you're drinking too much kombucha and you kind of feel a little bit out of it, it's probably too much. And probably there's other dysbiotic bacteria that you need to address. So lay off the kombucha too much. Okay. And then when you're trying to conceive, I just, if you're trying to conceive, if you're pregnant, small amounts, half a cup or a cup. And then another question came in around probiotic brands. So the brands that I typically go to are NFH, Metagenics, Genestra, HMF. Make some really good brands. Now that's not to say that these are the only ones. There's a lot of great brands. And as you can probably tell, there's a lot of research and a lot of understanding about these strains that go into choosing a probiotic. So those are the ones that I typically stick with. And then question here on, should I take probiotics and prebiotics for fertility? So probiotics, that's kind of the seed. It's helping to temporarily improve your microbiome volume and type of bacteria. But what we know with probiotics, when they do long-term studies, is if you take a probiotic, that change won't necessarily be long-lasting. And this is where the prebiotics come in. So it's really important to provide the appropriate food for the probiotics and for the natural residents and the good bacteria that are within your digestive tract, within the vaginal ecosystem. Because what you're trying to do long-term is encourage establishment of those particular strains so that you're kind of crowding out any of the pathogenic bacteria. And that can really help to prevent infections. There's a resiliency that comes when people have a higher variability within their ecosystem, within the community. And it's interesting. It brings up another point related to biofilms. So biofilms, I was thinking about this related to chronic infections. And often what happens, these bugs are so intelligent. So what they do is they produce, it's kind of like a force field, that it's these proteins and polysaccharides that create a little dome around where all these bacteria are. And so what can happen is, even if you take antibiotics, the antibiotics aren't able to get to where the infection is. So it's important, if you have a history of chronic infections, chronic gastrointestinal symptoms, to not only think about how to improve your microbiome, but you may have to address the pathology. So things like the biofilm, as well as different treatment strategies that we can use for breaking up that biofilm. So there was an interesting study that I came across looking at boric acid. Boric acid can be used intravaginally, so it can be a vaginal suppository. And they were looking at how, when this was used with an antifungal, it helped to improve recurrent vulvovaginal candidiasis, so yeast infections. So really, it can get quite complex, but it's important to think about, a lot of times, just taking a probiotic isn't going to be enough, depending on the ecosystem, depending on kind of what you're dealing with, and long term. And so if anyone has any more questions, please just put them in the chat, in the comments below. So my lovely moderator here is going to put the link for the probiotic chart within the bio. And then what I would recommend for you guys is, I want you to go to my Instagram. It's at Dr. Robin Murphy. So DrRobynMurphy. Please go there and like my page, follow me, so that you can keep up to date with some other cool research, information about the microbiome, about fertility. I absolutely love educating this community. You guys are rock stars. And make sure to call or book an appointment. Either you can see me for a 15-minute kind of introductory, just to see how I could support your case, or you can book online if you're looking for help. So there's my link below. Katie posted it. She's awesome. I really want to thank you guys for joining on this evening. You guys have been amazing. I love the questions. You guys are really insightful. And I hope you join us again for another Instagram Live. So take care and have a great night.